The marble halls of the Palazzo Vecchio echoed with whispered conspiracies as Niccolò Machiavelli walked through the corridors of power in Renaissance Florence. The year was 1513, and the political landscape had shifted like quicksand beneath his feet. Once a trusted secretary of the Florentine Republic, he now found himself exiled, suspected, and stripped of influence. Yet it was in this crucible of isolation and opposition that the most profound insights about conquering challenges would emerge. The morning sun cast long shadows across his modest estate in Sant'Andrea in Percosina as Machiavelli reflected on the nature of power, resistance, and triumph. He had witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the machinations of popes, and the brutal realities of political survival. What he understood, perhaps better than any man of his time, was that the greatest challenges often arise not from external circumstances, but from the very people who should support you, those who stand in your way when you need them most. In the dusty library of his exile, surrounded by leather-bound volumes of Livy and Tacitus, Machiavelli began to formulate what would become his most enduring insights into human nature and political maneuvering. The challenge was not merely academic. His own survival depended on understanding how to navigate a world where former allies had become enemies, where the Medici family viewed him with suspicion, and where every move was scrutinized by those who wished him ill. The first principle he identified was the necessity of strategic isolation. When everyone stands against you, the natural instinct is to seek allies indiscriminately, to compromise your position in exchange for temporary support. This, Machiavelli realized, was the path to certain defeat. Instead, he advocated for a deliberate withdrawal from the immediate fray, not as an act of surrender, but as a tactical repositioning. During his exile, Machiavelli observed how Francesco Sforza had conquered Milan not by immediately engaging his enemies in direct confrontation, but by carefully choosing his battles and allowing his opponents to exhaust themselves fighting each other. Sforza understood that when surrounded by hostility, the wise leader creates distance between himself and his immediate problems, using that space to gather intelligence, plan meticulously, and identify the true nature of the opposition. This strategic isolation served multiple purposes. First, it prevented the impulsive decisions that often arise from being constantly under pressure. When surrounded by hostile voices and immediate demands, even the most rational mind can be pushed toward hasty choices that serve short-term relief but undermine long-term objectives. Second, isolation provided the clarity necessary to distinguish between genuine opposition and mere opportunistic posturing. Many who appear as enemies are simply following the prevailing wind, and their hostility can be converted to support when circumstances change. The key insight Machiavelli developed was that isolation should never be passive. While withdrawing from immediate confrontation, the strategic mind must remain active, gathering information, building understanding, and preparing for the moment when action becomes both necessary and advantageous. He spent his evenings in careful correspondence with contacts throughout Italy, learning about political developments, military movements, and the shifting loyalties that characterized Renaissance politics. During this period of strategic withdrawal, Machiavelli also engaged in what he called the education of adversity. Rather than viewing his exile as purely punitive, he used it as an opportunity to deepen his understanding of political dynamics. He studied the ancient historians with new eyes, seeing in their accounts not merely historical curiosities but practical lessons about how power operates and how opposition can be overcome. The Roman general Fabius Maximus became a particular source of inspiration. Faced with Hannibal's invasion of Italy, Fabius had been mocked as the delayer for his refusal to engage in direct battle. Yet his strategy of strategic withdrawal, harassment, and patient positioning ultimately wore down the Carthaginian forces and preserved Roman power. Machiavelli saw in this approach a model for dealing with seemingly insurmountable opposition. Not through dramatic gestures or desperate measures, but through patient intelligence and tactical flexibility. This phase of strategic isolation also involved a careful analysis of one's own vulnerabilities and strengths. Machiavelli spent considerable time examining his own career, identifying the decisions and relationships that had led to his current predicament. This was not an exercise in self-flagellation, but a practical assessment designed to prevent future errors and identify patterns of opposition. He realized that much of the hostility he faced stemmed from his association with the Republican government that the Medici had overthrown. This association was both his greatest liability and, paradoxically, his greatest asset. While it made him suspect to the new regime, it also gave him credibility with those who remained sympathetic to Republican ideals. The challenge was to leverage this credibility without appearing to threaten the current power structure. The strategic use of isolation also involved controlling the narrative of one's circumstances. Rather than allowing his enemies to define his exile as evidence of disgrace or failure, Machiavelli carefully crafted an image of himself as a thoughtful observer of political affairs, someone whose temporary removal from active participation provided him with unique insights into the workings of power. His letters to friends and former colleagues subtly reinforced this narrative, presenting his exile not as punishment but as an opportunity for reflection and analysis. This approach required considerable psychological discipline. The natural human response to isolation and opposition is often anxiety, resentment, or desperate attempts to regain lost position. Machiavelli understood that these emotional responses, while understandable, were counterproductive. Instead, he cultivated what he called philosophical detachment, the ability to view his circumstances with the same analytical clarity he would bring to studying the political maneuvers of others. The discipline of strategic isolation also involved maintaining physical and mental health during periods of stress and uncertainty. Machiavelli established routines that kept his mind sharp and his body capable. He rose early, spent time in physical labor on his small farm, engaged in intellectual work during the most productive hours of the day, and maintained social connections with neighbors and visitors who could provide both companionship and information. Most importantly, strategic isolation was always temporary and purposeful. It was not an end in itself, but a preparation for eventual re-engagement. Throughout his exile, Machiavelli was carefully positioning himself for the moment when circumstances would allow him to return to active political life. He understood that this moment would come. Political fortunes in Renaissance Italy changed with remarkable frequency, and he was determined to be ready when it did. The letters he wrote during this period reveal a mind constantly working to understand the deeper currents of political change. He analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of various Italian states, the motivations of key political figures, and the broader trends that were reshaping the peninsula. This analysis was not merely intellectual exercise, but practical preparation for future involvement in political affairs. Understanding the nature of opposition. As winter settled over the Tuscan hills, Machiavelli turned his attention to a more complex problem: understanding why people oppose those who seek to accomplish significant goals. His observations of political life combined with his study of history had revealed patterns of opposition that transcended specific circumstances or individual personalities. Opposition, he realized, was not merely a response to particular policies or actions, but a fundamental aspect of human nature that must be understood and managed. The first type of opposition he identified was what he termed principled resistance. This came from individuals who genuinely believed that a particular course of action was wrong, dangerous, or contrary to their deeply held values. While such opposition could be formidable, it was also predictable and could often be respected if not overcome through reasoned argument and demonstration of good faith. More challenging was what he called interested opposition. Resistance that arose not from principle but from the perception that change threatened existing advantages, positions, or comfort. This type of opposition was particularly dangerous because it often disguised itself as principled resistance while actually being motivated by much more personal concerns. Those who benefited from existing arrangements would naturally resist changes that might diminish their position, regardless of the broader merits of such changes. During his years as a government secretary, Machiavelli had witnessed how proposed reforms to Florence's military system faced fierce resistance not because they were strategically unsound, but because they threatened the commercial interests of those who profited from the existing mercenary system. The opponents of reform argued eloquently about tradition, proven methods and the dangers of innovation, but their real concern was the potential loss of lucrative contracts and established relationships. The third type of opposition was perhaps the most insidious: fearful resistance. This arose not from principle or interest, but from anxiety about change itself. Many people opposed new initiatives not because they understood them to be harmful, but because they feared the uncertainty that accompanies any significant alteration in established patterns. This fear often manifested as excessive concern about potential risks while ignoring the costs of maintaining the status quo. Machiavelli observed that fearful resistance was particularly common among those who had achieved comfortable positions within existing systems. Even when they acknowledged problems with current arrangements, they preferred known difficulties to unknown possibilities. This type of opposition was often expressed through excessive demands for certainty, impossible guarantees, and endless deliberation designed more to delay action. Understanding these different types of opposition was crucial because each required different strategies for management. Principled resistance could sometimes be overcome through persuasion, demonstration, and compromise. Interested opposition required more sophisticated approaches, often involving the creation of new advantages for opponents or the gradual shifting of incentives. Fearful resistance demanded patience, reassurance, and careful management of the change process to minimize uncertainty. However, Machiavelli's most penetrating insight concerned what he called reflexive opposition, the tendency of many people to oppose ambitious undertakings simply because they were ambitious. This type of resistance had little to do with the specific merits of particular proposals, and everything to do with psychological and social dynamics that viewed bold action with suspicion. He had observed this phenomenon repeatedly in Florentine politics, where modest proposals often sailed through approval processes while significant initiatives faced intense scrutiny and resistance, regardless of their potential benefits. The very scale of an ambitious project seemed to trigger opposition from those who preferred incremental change or no change at all. This reflexive opposition often came disguised as prudence or wisdom. Opponents would raise endless questions about implementation details, demand exhaustive analysis of potential problems, and insist that any significant change be delayed until conditions were more favorable. While some of these concerns might be legitimate, the underlying motivation was often discomfort with bold action rather than genuine concern about specific risks. Machiavelli traced this pattern to fundamental aspects of human psychology. Most people, he observed, were more comfortable with familiar problems than unfamiliar solutions. They had learned to adapt to existing difficulties and had developed strategies for managing known challenges. Proposed changes, however beneficial they might be in theory, introduced new uncertainties and required new adaptations that many found psychologically threatening. Moreover, ambitious projects often highlighted the gap between what was possible and what currently existed, making some people uncomfortable about their own acceptance of suboptimal conditions. Rather than acknowledging this discomfort, they preferred to attack the proposals that created it, arguing that ambitious goals were unrealistic, dangerous, or inappropriate. This insight led Machiavelli to develop sophisticated strategies for managing opposition rather than treating all resistance as equally rational and responding with purely logical arguments. He learned to identify the underlying motivations of different opponents and tailor his approaches accordingly. For principled opposition, he emphasized respect for the opponent's values while demonstrating how proposed changes actually served those values better than current arrangements. This required careful listening, genuine engagement with opposing arguments, and willingness to modify proposals when opponents raised valid concerns. For interested opposition, he focused on understanding what opponents truly valued and finding ways to preserve or enhance those interests. This often involved creative problem-solving, identifying previously unrecognized opportunities, or restructuring proposals to create new sources of advantage for potential opponents. For fearful opposition, he developed techniques for reducing uncertainty and providing reassurance. This might involve implementing changes gradually, creating fallback options, or demonstrating success through small-scale pilots before attempting larger transformations. For reflexive opposition, however, he concluded that direct confrontation was often counterproductive. Instead, he learned to work around such resistance, building momentum through other means and creating conditions where opposition to ambitious goals became increasingly untenable. One of his most effective techniques for dealing with reflexive opposition was what he called the strategy of accomplished facts. Rather than engaging in endless debates about theoretical possibilities, he sought opportunities to demonstrate practical results. Once people could see tangible benefits from bold action, their psychological resistance to ambition often diminished significantly. This approach required careful timing and strategic thinking. The key was to identify opportunities where ambitious goals could be pursued without requiring extensive prior approval from those inclined toward reflexive opposition. Success in these limited arenas could then be leveraged to build support for broader initiatives. Machiavelli also recognized that opposition often contained valuable information, even when it was motivated by questionable factors. Opponents frequently identified genuine risks and problems that supporters, in their enthusiasm, might overlook. The challenge was to extract this valuable intelligence while not being paralyzed by resistance that was fundamentally psychological rather than analytical. This required developing what he called discriminating judgment, the ability to evaluate opposition based on its substance rather than its intensity or apparent confidence. Some of the most vehement opponents offered the least valuable insights, while quieter critics sometimes raised the most important concerns. The ultimate goal was not to eliminate opposition. Machiavelli understood that this was neither possible nor entirely desirable, but to understand it well enough to work with it effectively. Opposition, properly understood and managed, could actually strengthen ambitious undertakings by forcing more careful planning, broader coalition building, and more robust implementation strategies. The art of political maneuvering and ultimate victory spring arrived in Sant'Andrea with the promise of renewal, and Machiavelli felt the stirring of possibility. His months of strategic isolation and careful analysis had prepared him for what he now recognized as the most delicate phase of overcoming opposition, the actual implementation of strategies designed to achieve ambitious goals despite resistance. This was where theory met practice, where careful observation translated into effective action. The foundation of successful political maneuvering, he had concluded, rested on what he termed the principle of multiple pathways. When facing significant opposition, the common mistake was to identify a single strategy and pursue it with determination until it either succeeded or failed. This approach, while appearing admirably focused, was actually quite vulnerable because it allowed opponents to concentrate their resistance against a known target. Instead, Machiavelli advocated for the simultaneous development of several different approaches to achieving the same ultimate objective. This strategy served multiple purposes. It prevented opponents from organizing effective resistance against any single initiative. It provided alternatives when specific approaches encountered unexpected obstacles, and it created opportunities for tactical flexibility as circumstances evolved. During his diplomatic missions to France and Germany, he had observed how successful rulers maintained what they called strategic ambiguity about their specific intentions while remaining absolutely clear about their ultimate objectives. This allowed them to adapt their methods as opportunities arose while preventing enemies from anticipating and blocking particular moves. The key to implementing multiple pathways effectively was ensuring that all approaches remained genuinely directed toward the same goal. The temptation when facing opposition was to compromise objectives in order to reduce resistance. While tactical flexibility was essential, Machiavelli had learned that abandoning core objectives in response to opposition typically led to outcomes that satisfied no one and accomplished nothing significant. This insight had emerged from his analysis of various failed reform attempts in Florentine politics. Reformers often began with ambitious goals but gradually scaled back their objectives in response to opposition, telling themselves that modest progress was better than none at all. The result, however, was usually initiatives that were too weak to generate significant benefits but still strong enough to mobilize resistance from those who opposed any change. Machiavelli concluded that it was often better to pursue truly ambitious goals through indirect means rather than to pursue modest goals through direct confrontation. Ambitious goals, if achieved, created new realities that altered the entire landscape of possibilities. Modest goals, even when achieved, often left fundamental problems unchanged and opponents positioned to resist future initiatives. The art of indirect approach required sophisticated understanding of how complex systems responded to pressure and change. Rather than attacking opposition directly, the skilled political practitioner looked for ways to alter the conditions that gave rise to opposition. This might involve changing economic incentives, shifting social dynamics, or introducing new information that modified how people understood their interests. One of Machiavelli's favorite historical examples was Cesare Borgia's conquest of the Romagna. Rather than attempting to defeat all his enemies through military force, Borgia had systematically undermined their power bases by offering better governance to their subjects, more reliable protection to their allies, and more attractive opportunities to their supporters. By the time he moved militarily, much of the opposition had already evaporated. This approach required patience and sophisticated intelligence gathering. Success depended on understanding not just what opponents wanted, but why they wanted it, what they feared, and what might cause them to recalculate their positions. Such understanding could rarely be gained through direct confrontation, but emerged from careful observation, strategic conversation, and systematic analysis of behavior patterns. Machiavelli had learned to pay particular attention to what he called the contradictions of opposition. Most resistance to ambitious goals contained internal inconsistencies that could be exploited by careful practitioners. Opponents often advocated positions that conflicted with their other stated values, supported policies that undermined their own interests, or demanded outcomes that were mutually incompatible. For example, during debates about military reform in Florence, some opponents simultaneously argued that mercenary forces were more reliable than citizen militias and that foreign mercenaries were a threat to Florentine independence. These positions were logically inconsistent, and careful questioning could expose the contradictions in ways that weakened the credibility of the overall opposition. The exploitation of such contradictions required considerable diplomatic skill. The goal was not to embarrass opponents or score rhetorical points, but to create openings for more productive dialogue. When people recognized inconsistencies in their own positions, they often became more willing to consider alternative approaches, particularly if those alternatives were presented in ways that allowed them to maintain dignity and credibility. Another crucial element of effective political maneuvering was what Machiavelli termed coalition mathematics. Success in overcoming opposition rarely depended on converting dedicated enemies, but rather on shifting the calculations of those who were uncommitted or only weakly opposed to change. This required understanding the precise composition of opposition forces and identifying which elements might be detached or neutralized. He had observed that opposition coalitions were often more fragile than they appeared. They typically brought together groups with different motivations, interests, and priorities. While these groups might unite in opposing a particular initiative, they often had little in common beyond that opposition. Skilled political practitioners could exploit these differences by crafting approaches that appealed to some members of the opposition coalition while maintaining pressure on others. The timing of such efforts was crucial. Attempts to split opposition coalitions were most effective when undertaken before positions had become too rigid or when external circumstances created new pressures that altered the cost-benefit calculations of different groups. This required constant monitoring of political dynamics and readiness to act quickly when opportunities arose. Machiavelli also recognized the importance of what modern practitioners might call narrative warfare. How people understood the meaning and significance of various initiatives often mattered more than the technical details of those initiatives. Opposition forces typically sought to frame ambitious goals as dangerous, unrealistic, or inappropriate, while successful practitioners learned to frame the same goals as necessary, beneficial, and achievable. This battle over meaning and interpretation required careful attention to language, symbolism, and the broader cultural context within which political action took place. Successful practitioners didn't simply announce their intentions and argue for their benefits. They embedded their goals within stories and frameworks that resonated with their audience's existing values and aspirations. The ultimate objective of all political maneuvering was what Machiavelli called the creation of inevitability. Rather than forcing outcomes through pure power or persuasion, the most elegant victories occurred when circumstances evolved to the point where success became the natural and expected result of obvious trends. This type of victory was particularly valuable because it minimized resentment and resistance, creating conditions for stable long-term success. Creating inevitability required extraordinary patience and strategic vision. It meant working consistently toward long-term objectives while remaining flexible about short-term tactics. It meant building momentum gradually while avoiding premature confrontations that might galvanize opposition. Most importantly, it meant understanding that the most significant victories often appeared to outside observers as the natural result of favorable circumstances rather than the product of deliberate human agency. As summer approached and political winds began shifting throughout Italy, Machiavelli prepared to apply these insights to his own circumstances. His period of strategic isolation had served its purpose, providing him with both the understanding and the preparation necessary for re-engagement. The opposition he had faced was real, but it was not insurmountable. With patience, intelligence, and sophisticated execution, even the most entrenched resistance could be overcome. The principles he had developed through observation, study, and reflection were not merely theoretical constructs but practical tools for navigating the complex realities of political life. Whether applied to the governance of states, the management of organizations, or the pursuit of personal ambitions, these insights offered a path forward when conventional approaches had failed. The key insight that united all his observations was that opposition, however formidable it might appear, was rarely as solid or permanent as it seemed. Human motivations were complex, circumstances were constantly changing, and even the most dedicated opponents could be influenced by skilled practitioners who understood both the art of patience and the science of strategic action. Success in overcoming opposition was not about finding shortcuts or magical solutions, but about applying sophisticated understanding consistently over time, until external reality aligned with internal vision. It was about recognizing that every challenge contained within it the seeds of its own solution, and that the greatest victories often came to those who learned to work with the grain of human nature rather than against it. In the end, Machiavelli understood the ability to conquer challenges when everyone stands in your way was not a mysterious talent possessed by a fortunate few, but a learnable skill that could be developed through careful study, systematic practice, and the disciplined application of timeless principles to contemporary circumstances. The path was demanding, but it was always available to those who possessed the courage to walk it.